Ladies and gentlemen, we now present part 2 of Half the Sky Spotlight, the Strategic Partnerships panel, moderated by Michelle Byrd and featuring Ken Weber, Janet Riessman, Alyce, Myatt, and Jacqueline Pezzilo.
Hi, and thanks for settling in. So, I'm Michelle, this is Janet, Alyce, Jacqueline, Ken, just so you know the lineup. They're all going to introduce themselves shortly. Just quickly, how many, because it seems like a lot of people stayed from the first session. I'm curious, how many of you have actually played Half the Sky Movement the game? Great. Oh, we can raise our hands too, I didn't think about that. Okay, that's fantastic. So from the previous panel, you heard that this is a game that's executive produced by Games for Change. As you know, we're a nonprofit. I can't remember if it was actually mentioned in the first session or not, if Alyce mentioned it, but Games for Change actually owns the IP on the game, which I think is actually kind of interesting. As you know, Freeman was the studio that developed the game. And it's a game on Facebook. A couple of quick things for those of you who have not played it. I can't resist the ability to plug the website URL to go and check it out. It's facebook.com/halfthegame. It's an adventure game, as you can tell from the art and what the guys were talking about. It's raising awareness and funds to empower women and girls across the world. It's also available in English and French for anybody tuning in on the live stream. So a couple things in terms of thinking about partnerships. One of the things that's so immensely powerful about this project, and Alyce mentioned that the game is one component or a couple of components, this entire movement of Half the Sky, is that it's really based on partnerships. So the first and most important partnership that the organization had was with Nick Kristof and Charles Houdin. That was sort of the first point of trust. And I'd say that the thing that's really kind of interesting, and I'm going to ask all of the panelists to sort of speak to this, is that the issue of partnership in a creative endeavor that is about a social issue really does require trust. There's a clear understanding of your partners, clear understanding of their goals, their strengths, their concerns, because they operate outside of this project. So that's part of a little bit of what we're going to talk about. We're also, Alyce and Gabe were talking about some of the stats. And when they start talking, I'm going to actually throw up a link to what we're releasing for the first time, which is our impact report. So some of the numbers that you saw in the various presentations earlier, you don't have to keep scribbling them down, as long as you understand that this is a game on Facebook, so the numbers change, by the hour, by the day. We're giving you a snapshot of what the impact of the game, what the reach of the game is, and I'll throw that up on the screen in just a minute. But as you heard, there are 851,000 players right now. The audience is 78% female. So before we jump into the various questions, and we are going to have time for Q&A at the end, I'd like each of the panelists, starting with Janet, to give you 2 to 3 minutes on who they are, what their involvement is with the game, so that you have a frame of reference directly from them.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. My name is Janet Riessman. I'm the Director of Communications for Women, Girls, and Population at the United Nations Foundation in Washington, D.C. We've been involved with the game from the very beginning in 3 important ways. We are a funder, I believe the first funder of the game, which is sort of like, give it to Mikey, he'll eat it, and then a lot of others came along. We were also significantly played a part in content development and feeding content, and also a partner. So it's been quite a ride, and I look forward to talking more about it.
And I'm Alyce Myatt. I'm Director of Media Arts at the National Endowment for the Arts. And we were probably one of the last funders.
The last funder is the last on the line here.
Okay.
You're in progressive order, you didn't even realize it.
Who knew? And it was one of the first games that we funded under our new media arts guidelines. And as such, we got some pushback, not only externally, why is the NEA funding games? Games aren't art. And then also internally, why is the federal government funding games? And I pointed out to my colleagues at the NEA that we were probably one of the only federal agencies that wasn't funding games. You know, the Department of Defense certainly, and National Institute of Health. And, you know, we wanted to recognize and celebrate games as art and the artists that are involved in creating games, not just the graphic design and not just the music, but also the storytellers who are involved in the navigation process. And so games are in fact art, and we do fund them now.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Pezzilo. I'm with Room to Read. I'll tell you a little bit about Room to Read in case those of you are not familiar with it. We're an international nonprofit founded on the belief that world change starts with educated children. So the way that we approach this is by two programmatic pillars, literacy and girls' education. We were lucky enough to be one of the NGO partners of the Half the Sky documentary, and when we were approached by Nick Kristoff and Charles Woodon a few years ago, we were more than thrilled to be a part of this movement. So for those of you that have seen the PBS documentary, our segment went to Vietnam and documented a few of the girls that we support through our girls' education program. And if you were here for the last hour of this session, you'll also be aware that we're one of the partners of the game that's actually funded through this unlocked donations system. So the Pearson Foundation was kind enough to grant us $250,000. And by playing the game, you can actually put books in the hands of children through Room to Read.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ken Weber. I'm the executive director of Zynga.org, which is a standalone nonprofit that Zynga started. And our charitable purpose is to facilitate and promote the use of games for social impact. Part of what we do is we integrate causes and great organizations into Zynga games, but we also work with non-Zynga games and third parties. We also try to get our employees as engaged as possible in these kinds of projects. We're an enthusiastic funder of the game. I'm only learning today, we were the last ones invited to the dance. We also contributed in a couple of other ways. We pulled in 6 or 8 of our subject matter experts as advisors on the product development team. We work very closely with Games for Change and with FREMA, with whom Zynga had actually worked on some commercial games. So there was a great sort of basis for a kind of, as you said earlier, a trusting and constructive relationship, and it was great from start to finish. And once the game was live in the world, we were able to help promote it, as you saw from Assie's talk, and we're happy to be able to leverage our network for that purpose.
So there's something, we had a kind of pre-call last week, I think it was, and one of the questions that I asked everyone was, you know, this was a very difficult, in the beginning, Asi mentioned that this is 3 years in the making, this project, this Facebook game, excuse me, it's taken a long time. So once the money kind of came into place, it was essentially a year later that the game was released. So one of the questions I asked everyone is, you know, kind of what was interesting, and I'm going to ask Ken this question first because I thought he gave an interesting answer. What was sort of the interesting element related to this project? So Games for Change had not previously executive produced or produced games. This was a very ambitious project that clearly was a challenge to raise the money because it involves some risk in terms of thinking about this as an innovative extension of a brand that was based off of two, you know, journalists. So one of the things that Ken mentioned, if you could just share in terms of why you thought this was the game that Zynga could really get behind, but wasn't its own IP.
I mean, a bunch of reasons. You know, when I joined Zynga sort of as the do-gooder about a year and a half ago, there was a lot of email waiting for me, and I got a lot of calls from nonprofits and other corporate foundations who wanted us to create games for good from scratch. And it was, you know, it was often a terrible idea, but, you know, it was an interesting one and kind of an open question for us whether there was more opportunity in integrating social content into massive games that tens of millions of people were playing every day and going to where they were, or whether it made sense to kind of create something that was standalone. The risk there is that it's a walled garden. It's a destination that people have to go to versus, again, going to them in the context of what they're already doing. But this game, I thought Ian gave a great talk yesterday, and the use of the word earnest, I think, is astute. This seemed to have a lot going for it. It had great content, it had great partners, it had a bit of a media platform to begin with. It had some real funding, and it had a commercial game developer and somebody who we knew would know how to make a Facebook game that people would at least consider. And so it seemed like a good test of the idea that you can create a standalone game for social impact. And I think the goal was not to get to 10 million users and millions of dollars, but to sort of demonstrate, as Alyce said, that it's possible. Yeah.
Jacqueline?
So when we were approached by Nick and Cheryl to be part of the documentary series, that of course for us represented this huge opportunity to really spread our mission to a completely larger audience. And the game, when we were approached to be a partner in the game, just was an extension of that. I wish I could tell you that there was a whole lot of internal debate about whether or not we wanted to be part of this, but the story is much less dramatic than that. Room to Read has always, thought very deliberately about which brands to align ourselves with as we scale as an organization. And when a brand like Half the Sky approaches you, you really don't think twice about saying yes. And there was such strength behind the partners and the funders and the developers of this game that we really wanted to be part of the movement very, very early on and be part of a conglomeration of people and organizations that really believed in the power of social good through new media. So for us, this was just an extension of, as Alyce so eloquently put it, reaching beyond the converted, and it's for us as an organization that really looks to expand and diversify our investor base, a huge opportunity to do just that.
And this was the first game you guys were involved with?
This was, yes.
Right. Yeah.
One of the things that I found interesting was all of our projects that come in go through a panel process. And even when you have sophisticated panelists and you have them from all over the country, it requires a mind shift, a cultural shift to accept what is appropriate for the NEA to support. So even though panelists were behind, Nicholas Kristoff and Cheryl Boudin, even though they might have been behind the partnerships that were attached to the proposal, it took a while for them to become acclimated to the idea that the National Endowment for the Arts was going to fund a game. We knew, the media arts staff as well as senior staff knew all of the components added up to something that could be one of the larger projects that we supported, even though our support was a relatively small amount. And knowing Michelle and Alyce and knowing that this was an opportunity for us, I'll be quite blank, to ride your coattails, to say, here we've got something that is going to be publicized, and it will help us break out of the gate and help us change the notion of what is art.
What was the question? I didn't know that, was just so poetic. It was about the getting involved in sort of the first point of what was in the DNA of the project that made being a part of this game interesting. And in the case of UNF, you had several different entities within UNF that were involved.
Right. So we made the contribution, to the game actually before I came on board. But I learned also a lot of history about the Half the Sky book and the documentary and our involvement in helping to fund that. But it was in a way that it was very early in the process, and we didn't get to ride the coattails, as it were, of those projects. And so by funding the game, we very overtly wanted to be involved and really ride the coattails and get the credit we deserve for not just the donation, but the incredible content development. And as you mentioned, we have 5 sort of subject areas within the game where we provided content. And
Do you want to share with everybody what, for those who haven't played, what those?
see if I can remember them all.
Okay.
Yeah. So one is Girl Up, which is our sort of public-facing girls program where there are clubs all over the U.S. where girls in the U.S. connect with girls in the developing world around issues. There's Nothing But Nets, which is an anti-malaria program, very successful. Shot at Life, which is about vaccinations. Help me.
Aussie. Cook stoves.
Cook stoves, right, which is a major issue in the developing world, safety of cook stoves in the house. And I think just generally women's reproductive health issues. It's not actually a program within the organization, but women's reproductive health issues and choices they can and can't make in the developing world.
Right. As one of the things that was mentioned, alluded to in the first session, the kind of confluence, that slide that Asi showed about the Harlem Shake, as somebody who was sitting in the office and either hearing via conference call some of these folks talking about their issues, concerns, that now that that the game is about to launch, it's no longer a private closed beta, it's about to go public, just kind of where everybody was at. And that Harlem Shake slide, I've got to say, 100% captures sort of what was going on in terms of this is now something that everybody has been working on for so long, and it's now being released, and now each one of these entities that's sitting at the table needs to speak to its own player base, its own constituency base, its own funder base, and talk about and feel proud about their involvement in the game. And it was really important for us. I remember as we were moving towards launch, we started doing weekly conference calls. We had sort of a Friday 3 p.m. call with all the partners, kind of a round robin, so that everybody had a clear sense of what was going on, tightening up our communication so that everyone, we had a firm launch date. The launch was going to be March 4. We had preset a New York Times exclusive, so it meant that we were working under kind of embargo situation. You now have multiple partners. They all have stakeholders. Some organizations are quite small, some are quite large. So this period right around launch was immensely tense because it's going to be now quite public, and we're going to have all the players kind of coming to it. So I'm just curious in terms of anyone can just jump in and who feels like they have a thought about this, just in terms of the issue of the way in which these organizations were able to sustain their momentum and their interest in the project, because we needed all of them to blast out to their own constituencies. This game is going live, it's going live March 4, here's the app, go here, play. There was a kind of call to action. We've been hearing from our friends at Zynga, people want to show up at a party and they don't want to be the first ones in the door at a party. So I'm just, some of you who want to speak about the momentum.
One of the things that was fabulous was because it was in fact a momentum that was being amplified. And I'm a member of what's called the Federal Games Guild, and it's all of the federal agencies that have an interest in games, funding games or using games around their issues, whether it's pandemic or contagion or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And shortly, I guess it was within 2 weeks, you published your lessons learned, and it was the first substantive impact study, even though it was short term, that any of these federal agencies have had, which is kind of incredible. But the build up and then to have this in their hands, they were just knocked out. And I think that will have a lasting impact on agencies' funding and looking for evaluation, both short term and long term.
Speaking of that, I'm going to try and juggle and get up and throw the link up so that all the rest of you can download the report. Thoughts, Ken?
Sure. I mean, I think we came at it from a product development and marketing standpoint, so we're more like FREMA and less like funders. So, we were very focused on making the game the best that it could be up to the moment of launch, and then having, launch and what we call cross-promotional plans that would ensure, the greatest number of installs as possible and the quickest and shortest amount of time. So I think we listened in on some of those calls, but again, I think we had the luxury of just focusing on the product and the product launch.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, in terms of the involvement of Zynga in launch, during launch? And the specific support? He's being quite modest, I must say. The reality, and one of the things I think in terms of our lessons learned, is that the project really got out, has kind of gotten out into the marketplace and has as many players as it has because the organization was able to tap into the expertise and knowledge base and not have to learn that, which it never could have on its own in the time it needed to. It was able to rely on Zynga to provide that. So the cross-promotion, the Z-bar that Asi was showing, the ad spend, the ad agency, the managing it for us.
Yeah, I mean, this was not only a test of whether you could make a game like this and have it succeed, it was a good test of whether a game maker like Zynga, a corporate, a corporate game maker with 3,000 employees could actually, get involved and add value and, make the product better. It was also a good demonstration of sort of the unfair distribution advantage that Zynga has given the size of its network, and how finely tuned its promotional apparatus is in terms of how we understand targeting on Facebook, how we use various different assets like the Z-bar. So, I think prior to the launch of this game, a lot of standalone games for good were reliant on organic growth, on preaching to sort of the choir and the converted, to getting on Ellen through somebody who knew somebody, and seeing how that would create adoption and retention. But we tried to treat it as we would have treated our own games, and to leverage all the the assets and tools that we had at our disposal. And I think that that worked.
Yeah, that worked great. So one of the things I think that we to just point out again in terms of some, we're now at the point where the game has been out since March 4. We've got some great, we're very proud of it. We've got some great stats in terms of the reach and the impact, which Ozzy showed, which I'll put up on the screen in a moment. So 14 minutes of average is the average play session. Hit 851,000 players. Of those players, 78% are female. So these are some interesting stats 3 months out. And one of the things that we think those are great numbers. And one of the things that a lot of times we get questions about is how are you measuring how are you measuring the impact? So one of the sort of questions we want to sort of throw out to everybody on the panel is really this idea of what equals success. And if you start thinking about some of these stats relative to other communications tools, flyers, other things that are kind of within the means of nonprofits, NGOs, I think these numbers are I think they're already quite good, but I think they become even more remarkable. And I'm just curious if those of you from, particularly some of the NGOs, your thoughts, because you're now taking that back to your organizations.
Right. I think what we've learned is that the ROI, as it were, on the game and our investment in the game is really is the incredible reach that you speak of, and any donations or whatever are sort of frosting on the cake. But the reach is incredible, and I think also, Ozzy mentioned this earlier, but the book reached hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. But there were people who were willing to read a difficult read and probably already converted. And same with the documentary. It was hard to watch. It was very intense. Again, those who watched it, I think, were already converted. I think the thing about the game that makes it so spectacular for us is it's reaching people who would never think about women's empowerment, the girls' empowerment, what they face in the world outside of the United States and developing countries. And particularly when I think somebody told a story about mothers and daughters watch it or playing together. A couple of my friends have done that with their daughters and told me just beautiful stories. And one of them being, the little girl asked, what do you mean they don't have any books? Like, how does the school not have any books? And she asked the difference between an advocate and an activist. And so just really learning so much and playing together, and I thought that was just beautiful. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's been the ROI for us.
Yeah. Jacqueline?
I would agree wholeheartedly that for us, the ROI and the impact measurement really is with the awareness raising as opposed to our traditional other metric of fundraising as an NGO. The game really allows us as a partner to raise critical awareness about the issues of women's oppression worldwide, and everyone that plays the game, I believe even if they didn't feel like this before they logged on, understands that women are not the problem but rather the solution. And for Room to Read, it's really that activation of action that we're looking for, and this game really does inspire collective action and allows players to understand that just through a very simplistic moment of playing this game, which is entertaining, they are actually changing the lives of boys and girls around the world through this donation of Room to Read by unlocking books by playing the game. So for us, I really think it's the awareness raising, but it's also allowing people to understand that it doesn't take much to battle the very daunting statistics of 775 million illiterate people in the world, 2/3 of them being women and girls.
Ken, thoughts on measuring the impact?
I mean, I think you're right. Some smart people from E-Line or some other consultancy should help us to figure out sort of how to credibly compare the ROI on this to other, media, direct mail, hanging banners, on lampposts during UN Week, expensive speaking tours by principals of foundations. It seems to be a pretty inexpensive way to reach new audience members, and in our own integration of social impact content into our commercial games, we try to work with our nonprofit partners to get a handle on how many of the participants are new to the organization, how many of them have they captured. We've done some surveys around, are you now more likely to support this organization in the future? And most of the data that we have is pretty suggestive. So in working with Water.org, for example, on some of the campaigns we've done with them, more than half of the players who've come through and made a contribution to Water.org through a Zynga game are actually new to the organization. So, I think looking at the comparative ROI relative to other tools, as well as looking at sort of, the LTV of these supporters, I think is critical, so that we can say with some credibility that this is additive. Yes.
Great. Yes.
And there's a funder affinity group, Grantmakers in the Arts, and there's a subset which is a working group, Art for Social Change. And this just became another tool in their toolbox of using art for social change. And I was able to give a presentation a couple of years ago when the proposal first came in, and I said, this is something that we're looking at, and this is, again, yet another thing that you should consider when you're saying you're funding art, that games can fit within the social change movement.
We're going to go to questions from the audience in just a couple minutes, but I'd like to ask each of you if you were to share kind of a takeaway where we are now on the game, one thing that you think members in the audience, how many of you are from NGOs or governments? Okay. How many of you are developers? Okay, so kind of split half and half. That's sort of nice. If there's one thing standing where you are today that we know about our collective experience on Half the Sky movement, the game, what would you share with this group that you haven't already shared?
I mean, I would just go back to Ian's talk yesterday and suggest that, he add a modifier to his thesis. An earnest, properly capitalized game, I think, is the one that probably has the best chance to not just be talked about, but to be played. And, talented firms like Frema, need the hours and the room to make the game as compelling as it can be. I think it probably also underscores the importance of indie developers and, you know, people like the Plague Inc. developer who, you know, I think made us all feel very lazy yesterday when he said that he sort of had done this in his spare time in addition to, you know, on evenings and weekends. But, you know, passionate, you know, people who understand sort of game design, having them understand that they're sort of the other end of the spectrum, but that they can also break through with these sort of under or uncapitalized games. I think it's really important to have both of those ends of the spectrum kind of working on this long-term, you know, project that we're all involved in.
Great, thank you. Jacqueline?
So from a nonprofit perspective, for those of you that are my colleagues in the audience, I would just say for us, this has really been a lesson in the importance and value of embracing innovation. As Michelle mentioned, it is the first time that we've been part of a transmedia project, especially one that involves a game, and it's really been a valuable lesson for us in how important it is to really think innovatively in terms of fundraising strategy and awareness raising strategy. I think there's a whole generation of millennials that really grew up with this understanding of how important it is to give back to the community because it was kind of built into their schooling requirements, et cetera. And as NGOs grow and really look to diversify their donor base, I think it's so important that we continuously seek opportunities to really reach that audience and fulfill their desire to give back and affect social change.
Great, thanks. Alyce?
First, I have to thank you and Alyce for our first game success. And to say to the NGOs and the designers, developers out there that we are open for business at the NEA, and our next deadline is August 8th.
So lessons learned, is that?
Well, a kind of takeaway that,
Yeah, so I think something that was really major for us in the whole thing, including very close to the end, was taking these very complex issues, lack of books, need for fistula, malaria, vaccinations, etc., and talking about them and kind of exploring them fun. That was challenging, and I thank both you and Ozzy for helping us get there and allow it to be fun and but still a learning experience. I think also sort of a takeaway for this audience particularly is I've learned so much about gaming since sort of jumping in or being thrown into the work of Half the Sky. I wish it had been opposite. I wish I had learned everything I've learned through things like this, through a summit I attended at Games for Change, before jumping into the game and helping to develop the game, because I think I would have been much more productive and my contribution would have been more valuable.
That's great, thanks. So I want to thank everybody here, and I want to open it up to questions. Yes, and I'll repeat your question.
The big thing that I've been wondering through Alyce's presentation versus this one is, given the 3-year time frame to ramp up before March 4th, is knowing what you know now, and that time frame be compressed, and that's like sort of came into this panel when he asked. But Alyce's comment about the metrics on this, and you're making this so transparent, just blows me away in terms of this has raised the bar not only for the federal government but for the whole industry about transparency. And this is a problem that has bedeviled the whole nonprofit and foundation sector for decades. Is how do you get money for metrics on things that you do to tell whether it's doing or good? So this is huge. This could really, as the Brazilians say, push the sardine toward gaming because of the availability of metrics.
That's exactly.
Thank you. So that was a comment. It was a great comment. Okay, so the 3 years, just to be clear, was raising money. There wasn't. Oh, can you compress finding the money more quickly? Of course, that can. I don't even know how to answer that. Yes, we would always want the money more quickly. Yes, that's just simple answer. Yes. But one thing I will say is that it's been very important because Games for Change is a nonprofit. And its mission is social impact games. And if the organization is involved in a specific project, it's imperative that the lessons learned, the knowledge gained, from being in the midst of all of what's going on, and the lessons learned, that must be shared. That is the value of this organization. That's why you're here. That's why we exist. So it's really critical. So you'll continue to see that sort of stuff coming from us.
I think one of the issues in terms of the timeline, I think traditional funders are always going to be slow. And it's going to take them a long time before they get into a more rapid, funding cycle. I mean, at the NEA, you apply in August, which I hope all of you do. But if you're approved for funding, you will not know until April of the following year and won't receive a check until June. Okay, I can't fix that right now. I'm still trying to fix some other things. But I think that there's other money available, such as Zynga.org and Google.org and some of these newer funders that are in the sector that come from a VC standpoint but want to, consider themselves social entrepreneurs. And I think it's important that you look at these new funding sources and convince these new funders who are comfortable working at a more rapid timeline. But it also means that you have to be very clear about what you're doing, what your business plan is, even if you are a nonprofit. But you have to be very strategic about your process, as well as your promotion and engagement. And your NGO partners are absolutely critical, because that's going to signal to them that you're going to be able to get your gains out into the world.
Ken?
I mean, I think that's very insightful about going after sort of more readily available capital. I think that's critical. But I also think that we can all do some advocacy within the funder space about, how quickly these projects need to be funded. I mean, the lesson learned about Late for Facebook is a great, that's the reason. Had the game launched, 18 or 24 months prior, it would have been a different ballgame. When I got to Zynga a year and a half ago, 10 or 15% of the company was mobile, and they were somewhere up on the 6th floor, and you needed a special badge to get in there. And 6 months later, it was the opposite. And now everything we do is mobile. I mean, the games business is brutal, and it's fast moving, and the technology is, it changes all the time. So, these efforts will lag behind unless there is available funding more quickly.
Other questions? Yes?
Talk a little bit more about target audience, and I know that's the first step in the social chart. Like, how do you decide which audience is a global issue? How do you kind of narrow the audience? How much do the partners have, and do they want to agree on who the audience is, or
So the question is really about the audience and how was it determined, what was the audience for the game? Is that what, yeah. And who determined it? So it was, the original source material was really the book. So that already laid out a certain kind of set of issues around women and girls in the developing world, largely. A new kind of flavor, if you will, that was added to it, to the Facebook game that did not exist in any of the other components, was the US component. So the sort of circling back and saying, it's not just an issue out there, there's also issues related to women and girls here in our own country. And actually, if you look in the report, there's a little bit more information about, some of the NGO partners were picked specifically for their issues that they worked on and their ability to translate into gameplay and quests. So there were some things that were more easily translated into the gaming format than others. Other questions?
I have a few questions. The first one is, and before we have this guy from before you launched, I'm from the Caribbean, in the Connecticut sector. And I recognize there was a book property that there was a documentary, which means that in terms of risk, it was easier to navigate because we had already these properties that were doing so well. Is that always the process for the rest of the fund, or how small scale do you go versus this, which seems to me to be like the epitome of like a professional coalition
So you're saying this is a super group?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Okay, okay, I just want to make sure.
Right, so for those of us who don't have the capacity of a game-to-game organization, we just be an independent filmmaker with a great idea and some partnership links with NGOs in a smaller space like in the Caribbean that's not American or that's not global. How do we try to access like Single or NEA? You know, if you think that the potential of your project has potential for like global coalition.
Right. Well, I've got a question, just in terms of Zynga.org. You don't give grants, or do you give grants?
I mean, we're not a grant-making organization. I mean, we do fund things that we're actively engaged in, but we're not the Gates Foundation or any foundation.
Right.
I mean, we get asked a lot by small NGOs, can you help us create a game? And and most often the answer is, well, it's probably not where you should put your chips, just given the competition and all the variables. The fact that this game is based on existing content is actually pretty congruent with how a lot of games make it to market in the first place. So a lot of content is licensed from movies and other books. A lot of almost all games out there are a version of a game or games that preceded it, and there hopefully some kind of improvement on those games. So there are going to be exceptions that break through, like a play game. But for small organizations with limited resources, I mean, this stuff is so capital intensive and could be such a distraction. I think maybe finding your way in, as a partner in a game or as a contributor of content in a game, or finding an existing game that you can share with your supporters to get them engaged. I would say it'd be very, very rare occasion where, as a small NGO, you would set out to create a commercial game.
For us, it was a little bit different because we had a wide variety of applications, and so while Half the Sky was probably the largest first-to-market game that we funded, we also funded a game that's being produced by USC based on Walden Pond. And we also funded a game being produced by Spelman College called Her Adventure. And we also funded a game being produced by the Flea Theater here in New York. That's a theater game. So we have essentially the luxury to look across the board, but because we're public money, we have to be really careful so that no one can accuse us of wasting it. Which they accuse of us, regardless, right? But I have to be able to argue against, their use of the term waste. So, in terms of the Caribbean, certainly U.S. territories in the Caribbean can apply to us, but it has to be, a U.S. territory or a state or the District of Columbia.
Yeah, and my instinct with Room to Read and UNF, you're not looking to create your own games in tandem with a small NGO. That would be my
Exactly. I think that we do, almost everything we do is in partnership with other organizations that bring content knowledge and perhaps funding and help us reach a broader audience, etc.
I saw, yes?
I'm wondering just in terms of, as a movement, the way that this whole thing is rolled out and, in terms of the schedule, first the book, then the series, then the game, do you think that's an advantage, or do you think that if we were able to do it all in a more compressed time, so you could promote it all together?
Well,
that would be better?
yeah, so the question is, it seems like that was the plan, that there was a book, then a documentary series, then a game. The reality is, had we had that money, all, kind of all at once, these things were supposed to have happened, more or less all at once. So I believe in the beginning, the game was supposed to go first, Alyce, right? 3 months prior to the launch of the broadcast. So the game was actually, because it was unfunded, couldn't come first. So then it was really seeking out the best opportunity that was closest to when the time of the game was going to be ready. So the game was also going to come out originally in November of 2012. So, games, they take longer than games. laughing. They take a little bit longer than the schedule that's sometimes agreed to up front. So I think in this case it all worked out, but that was not the original way it was supposed to go down.
Can I just add also that I think, I love the way you called it a movement, and I've heard that over the last day and a half a lot. It is a movement now. It's not a book, it's not a documentary, it's not a game. It's a movement, and there is more coming. Nick is working on another book, Show of Force is working on another documentary. There will probably be another game.
I don't know, I'm not just at liberty to talk about that. So, yes.
I was really interested to hear from some of the people, not from UN, because I know that you have like sexual health and reproductive rights built into your organization, and as the first funder, like this is really an issue that you're passionate about and you want to see a game created to address. For some of the other people who were a part of this project, I was wondering if you could share maybe some of the conversations that you had or concerns around funding a game that included sexual health and reproductive rights issues.
So the question is, not for UNF, but really for some of the others on the panel, their concerns about a game involving sexual health or reproductive health issues. Right, and particularly since, as we have been saying, one of the things that we didn't expect is that moms would be playing this with their kids.
I mean, we tend to embrace issues that are
To issues related to women's empowerment, women's reproductive and sexual health and rights issues in the developing world. I think we're just reaching an incredibly diverse audience and very different than our traditional audience who are already adopters, as it were.
Yeah, and for us, similarly, being a part of the Half the Sky movement, which involves the documentary as well, has yielded incredible numbers, both in terms of fundraising and awareness raising. I mean, we've seen $1.2 million in donations come in through our involvement with the documentary and the game. We've seen a huge uptick in social media following, around the time that the PBS documentary came out. Year over year, we were up 80% in web traffic. So that to us, all screams the value of being a part of the movement. So we're more than delighted to be a partner.
For us, it was, could the game make a case for the next game, for a little bit more funding, for a little bit more lead time, for a little bit more focus on the service side versus just the product side, more resources for after launch to keep the game alive and to keep players engaged. Internally, as I mentioned earlier, I think it was a test of whether or not we could engage our talented employees and whether or not they could really add value through a project like this. And resounding yes on both, and we actually look forward to being involved in future projects.
And for us, it similarly, can it make the case for the next game, but also can it make the case for advertising and promotion of media arts grantees, which is something that had not been done. And because of the great work that your team did, we were able to, push further and internally have more support for our media arts grantees.
Yeah, and I think that's it. So we don't want to hog up the day. So thank you for coming, and appreciate it.